Welcome to Courage for Life Conversations. I'm Ann White, and today we're going to be discussing the Gospel of John. And for this discussion, I've invited a dear friend. He's an author, speaker, media producer, and co-founder of Cooke Media Group, Phil Cooke. Phil, thank you so much for joining me today. It's wonderful to have you here. I appreciate you traveling all this way.
Not a problem at all. I'm thrilled to be here. Wherever you are, I'm happy to be because we always have the most interesting conversations.
We certainly do. And this is one of my favorite books of the Bible. So I'm super excited about that. Now, if we're talking about the Gospels, the Gospels in general are very different and very unique.
Yes.
They all come from different perspectives. But if you could say you had a favorite or maybe one or two favorite Gospels, what would that be?
This is very similar to the question I get in Hollywood about which is my favorite movie. And I have millions of movies that I adore and I like very much. But I would have to narrow it down to a couple. One is Mark because it's short, sweet, to the point. I mean, Mark was really trying to get the story out right away. But then what we're going to talk about today is John. It was written much later, more reflective. It's a whole different perspective on the life of Jesus. So I think two is the best I could do. I'm not sure if there's a one I like the best.
I know, and they are so different.
Yeah.
So what would you say are the differences? If you look at Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, why are they coming from such different perspectives, do you believe?
Yeah, well, of the four Gospels, three are synoptic, which simply means kind of a synopsis of Jesus' life. It's a chapter by chapter summary of what he did, where he went, what he taught. And it's interesting that they don't always agree on things. There's a number of places where they tell kind of a different story. It's a little disjointed. Some people would say that they're wrong, and other people would say, well, they're just telling it from a different perspective. John does the same thing, even in a bigger way in many ways. But it's interesting, and a lot of people people I know have walked away from the faith because they look at that and they think, well, it's contradictory. They don't tell the same story. They don't match. What's the problem? If I can't trust the Gospels, how can I trust anything in the Bible? And they literally walk away from their faith. But it's an interesting thing because my life is communication. That's what I do for a living as a media producer. And it's interesting that when the Titanic sank, after it was over, the survivors that were rescued, they interviewed them about the experience. And almost half of them said, the ship broke in half before it sank. The other half said, no, it went down fully as one big ship. And they were all looking at the same thing, but they told a completely different story. And there's a landmark study in communication of a professor years ago who was teaching a class, and a man rushed into the room with a gun. And he was screaming at people. He was waving the gun around. He was shouting. And after a few minutes of that, he turned and left the room. And the students were terrified. They were mortified. And the professor said, look, the police are going to want to report. So I want everybody in the room to write down what just happened. Now, they didn't know it was staged. And so they wrote it down, and every single story was different. 30 kids in the room, college students. They didn't agree on the clothes the guy was wearing. They didn't agree on the type of gun he had or what color it was. Some said he was white, some black, some said Hispanic. They didn't agree on what he said. So it really shows you that from different perspectives, you write different stories. And so I think, every disciple was different. And I think they came from a different background, a different perspective. So in fact, I was thinking the other day, if 2 or 3 days from now, you and I would write a story about our conversation today, you would probably focus on the Bible teaching, the conversation. I would put some of that in, but I'm a media producer, so I'd talk about the studio we filmed in and the crew that we had and the equipment we used. So I think when you look at it that way, in fact, I often say, I don't want to rant on this because we're focusing on John, but I've often said that if I was going to fake a religion, if I was going to create a religion that was totally fake, I'd want everything to line up perfectly. I wouldn't want any contradictions, anything, no discrepancies. Nobody could question.
Yeah.
And so in many ways, the fact that these stories are told differently is a real testament to me of their authenticity. It's their real.
Yeah, and you look at the authors. They come from different walks of life.
Yeah.
So talk about that a little bit because we know John was a fisherman.
Exactly. Well, it's interesting that Matthew was writing primarily to a Jewish audience.
Correct.
Why the genealogy, he started with a genealogy. He wanted to show people that Jesus came from the line of David. Mark was more interested in writing for a secular or a Roman audience at the time. And so he was thinking about how do I explain this story to them? And then Luke, it's interesting, was Greek, and he was writing to a Greek audience. Now, Greek was the kind of the what they call it, the lingua franca of the time. It was like English today. It was the business language. It was the political language. And so he was writing to a much broader audience. And then the interesting thing about John is he came in much, much later, much later, decades later. And it was at a time when heresies were popping up in the church all over the place. And I think he felt this need to confront those heresies and really straighten people out about what the gospel really was. In fact, it's interesting that in John, he talks, you'll as you read John, you keep seeing this phrase, truly, truly, I say unto you. And in the ancient world, that was like, okay, guys, listen up. This is really important. You need to pay attention to what I'm about to say. And although each translation says it a little bit differently, it's essentially the same phrase. And that happens 25 times in John. It happens once in the other Gospels.
Right.
So John was really trying to say, okay, look, this is what the gospel is really all about. And he was much more reflective, where the other three Gospels talk about the places Jesus went, the message he shared. John was more interested in reflecting on what the meaning of that message was. And so that's why I like reading that book, because in fact, the vast majority of material in John about Jesus doesn't even appear in the other Gospels.
That is correct.
It's remarkable.
I know. I love that about that. And I love how he starts out, because he begins with creation.
Yes.
And so he tells us something that the other Gospels don't share.
Yes.
And it's a beautiful depiction of Christ there at creation, and then moving in, to his life.
It's really the big picture.
It is.
It really is. It really is.
Now, if you had a favorite chapter in the book of John, is there a favorite chapter or a favorite passage?
I think 12 is the high priestly prayer, right? I think that's chapter 12.
17 is where
it 17?
I go, yes.
Okay.
The prayer of Jesus right before he goes.
Right before he goes to Gethsemane.
That is my favorite as well.
It's a powerful statement. It's in a long prayer. It's one of the longer prayers in the Bible, certainly that Jesus did, but it explains so much about why he came and who he came for. I don't want to make any enemies here, but I sometimes get put out with people that all they talk about is Jesus is love, Jesus is love, whatever you want to do is fine, he loves you. Well, that's true. However, in that chapter, he talks about, look, I came for these people that you gave me, these disciples. I didn't come for the world. I'm not praying for the world right now. I'm praying for them and the people that will come after them because of the message they share. And so it really makes you stop and think that we need to respond to this message. It's very, very important. And also the other thing about John, I'll say, is that because it's a really well thought out presentation of the gospel, that's why we have verses like John 3:16 that's probably the most used verse in history when it comes to leading somebody to Christ.
Right.
And so there's so many verses like that in John that just are a perfect, genuine explanation of what the salvation experience is all about. Other Gospels talk about being saved, being born again, all those kind of phrases that we use all the time. However, I think the most perfect explanation of the salvation experience probably comes in John.
That is so beautifully said. I agree with you 100%. And one other thing I love about the Gospel of John is the I am statements.
Yes.
Because we really learn a lot about Jesus, and the things that he said, who he said he was.
It's true. That's true. And it's so funny because when I read John, it forces me to stop and think, because like I said earlier, he was reflective. He was trying to look back on all those years and the life of Jesus and what it meant. So today we live in a media-driven culture. Some studies indicate the average person sees 10,000 media messages every day. We've changed our behavior to where literally we have the attention span of a goldfish. We make a decision in 3, 4 to 8 seconds, when we encounter someone or something. And so in that incredibly hectic, distracted world, reading John forces you to slow down and really reflect on what this is all about and what it meant and what Jesus' life really stood for. And so anytime I get a chance to slow down a little bit, count me in. I'm in. I love it.
Absolutely. And so in the Gospel of John, as he is saying these I am statements, I am the bread of life, are there any particular I am statements that you love the most, or what do you learn about Jesus from the book of John in particular? Is there anything that stands out per se? Yes,
I think that it's the interesting thing about Jesus throughout the book of John. I go back to your comment earlier. First of all, he was here from the beginning. Think of this, in the early days of the early church, people didn't think that way.
Yeah.
He wanted to show, look, this is not a guy that just showed up when he was born. This is a person that was with God from the very beginning. And we often forget that the Old Testament, we think very often of the Old Testament being a separate book that has no real relevance for us today. But the truth is, Jesus was back there too. He was back there from the very beginning of the first chapter of Genesis and beyond. And so I think it reminds us that Jesus has been a part, and in fact, reading John makes you look at the Old Testament in a different way. And when you read the Old Testament, suddenly you start saying, wait a second, they're talking about Jesus here. And in every book. And so it's just a really remarkable experience to think. I just finished a book by Philip Yancey, who I think is a brilliant author, called The Bible Jesus Read. And we forget that the New Testament wasn't around when Jesus was, or when the disciples and the apostles were around. It was being formulated, but they were reading the Old Testament. And so all these amazing things that Jesus taught, that the Gospels taught, that Paul eventually taught, and Peter they were talking about the Old Testament and its fulfillment and its prophecies and what it was saying about Jesus. So we need the reminder of that perspective, and I think John does that.
We absolutely do. We absolutely do. And I think you're right, because so much of the Old Testament is brought in through the Gospels.
Yes.
And really, Jesus fulfilling those prophecies of Isaiah and so forth that, I think the prophets are a little difficult sometimes to study.
Oh.
But I love them.
Yeah.
And because they set the stage for Jesus to enter the scene.
They really do. And I think speaking of the prophets, they drive me nuts because they were depressing. They're always angry. They're upset.
Some of them
but
are.
when you look at when you read them along, I'm reading a chronological Bible. So I'm reading it as if it was all one big story, and they're cutting and pasting chapters together, which is a fascinating experience. And I don't know how you feel about it, but I highly recommend it because
I absolutely do too.
Suddenly you read the prophets in the context of Kings and Chronicles and the books that describe what was the history of what was happening.
What was happening while they're prophesying.
Yes, and you see king after king after king refuse to follow God. They would step away. Every once in a while, someone would fear God and step in and fix things, but overall, so once you read it like that, you understand why the prophets were so frustrated with Israel at the time. And it's no different today. I mean, look at the culture we live in. People have completely turned their back on God in spite of the incredible things that he does and the evidence for his existence. People have turned their back. So it makes me much more sensitive.
I think that's a beautiful statement. I want to read this one verse, 1633.
Okay.
It says, this is where Jesus tells us, I have told you all of this so that you will have peace in me. Here on earth, you will have many trials and sorrows, but take heart because I have overcome the world. And I love that passage. It's not maybe my favorite passage in the world, but I would say it's a very realistic passage. I know we're all looking for hope, and we live in a culture today that is desperate for hope, truly.
Yeah.
Desperate for our emotional health to be strengthened. We're desperate for healthy relationships.
Yeah.
And so when we look at the fact that Jesus told us, God told us right up front, you're going to have trials and sorrows. Now, how do you take this book, the book of John, and pull encouragement and hope from this book, from what's being said here?
All right, two things. Number one, many years ago, probably 22 years ago, I guess, I produced a television special with Billy Graham, a big global event. And he said that classic line, I've read the last chapter of the Bible and we win.
Yes.
And so I've overcome the world is a powerful testament to the fact that no matter what we're going through, we know we may not be able to see the end of the tunnel yet, but we know that God has a plan for all this, and he's in. The second thing I think that's important is I kind of go back to chapter 15, verse 7. If you abide in me and my words abide in you, ask whatever you wish, and it will be done for you.
Amen.
Now, that reminds me that there's something for me to do. If I abide in him and his word abides in me. So we can't just think, okay, God's going to bail me out. God's going to, answer my problem. So many people think he's going to heal my sickness or disease, or he's going to get me a new job. But we don't take the responsibility of really taking a deep dive into the Bible to really understand what God's plan for our life. And so I think John is just a powerful reminder to me. And he says something similar over and over again in John, that there's something for me to do. I have to be, there's something I need to do. And so often I look at today and I just think, how shallow so many Christians are. They want to take the good parts. They're thrilled that God will come help them, but they're not so, that whole praying thing. I'm not really into that. I don't do that so much. Or that reading the Bible. I'm a busy person. I got a lot of things to do. I wrote a book a number of years ago called The Way Back, how Christians blew our credibility and how we get it back. And
that's a great title.
Well,
and I've read
you.
most of your books, but I have not read that one. I need to get that one.
Well, we started it because we were concerned about why Christianity is disappearing from the culture.
Yes.
And we thought, I'm a
especially our youth.
Yes. And I'm a media producer and a marketing guy. And I thought, well, maybe we're not telling the story well. So we went to Pew Research and Barna and Gallup and Lifeway and started studying how Christians live their lives. And we found out almost 70% of Christians in the pews on Sunday, not just Christians people who call themselves Christians, but people who show up at church, read the Bible once a month, rarely or never. And so you're expecting God to respond when you're not even taking the time to respond to him? That's amazing to me. And we found out that it was funny. We found out 63% of Christians in church today believe that prayer is essential. When I thought, okay, that's a win, 63%, that's the majority. But then I realized, wait a second, that means 37%, more than a third of the people in church on a typical Sunday today don't believe prayer is important. And I'm thinking, we wonder why Christianity is disappearing from the culture. We wonder why, Rodney Stark, who's a great sociologist who passed away a number of years ago, was at Baylor, said that the single greatest reason people convert to a religious faith is because they want to be like those people. And I thought, wait a second, we're not living a life anybody wants to be like. We're not into the word. We're not praying. We're not, sharing the gospel with people. Why would this culture want to be like us? We're not living any different from them. So John is a powerful reminder that there's something for us to do. We have to get with it here. I think if we really want to take the culture back, if we want to really focus the culture on God and turn this nation and the world, for that matter, around, there's something for us to do. We have to get serious about the Bible. We have to get serious about prayer. We have to get serious, just like the Old Testament prophets used to say, you've got to get with it. It's time, to turn back towards God.
Yeah, we can't expect God to just do it all for us.
Right. Oh, totally.
And that is truly what I think a lot of people, but when you look at the disciples and you read the Gospels, you see not only the suffering that they went through and the persecution, you see the strength.
Yes.
You see the power of them. Even when they were writing, when you go to the Apostle Paul and he's writing from prison quite often and in a lot of difficult situations, but that God is a God for everybody. He's got a second chances, but you're right. We have to take action. He doesn't expect us to just sit back and let him do it. And that's
so true. And doubt is okay. Doubt is okay.
That's important to know too.
And I remember Thomas, the disciple who doubted Jesus, became Doubting Thomas. Everybody calls him Doubting Thomas. However, I've been in India filming where they are pretty convinced Thomas ended up, which means the disciple that doubted Jesus the most traveled the furthest to share his message.
Isn't that beautiful?
He went all the way to India in a day when you walked, when you walked. And so when you think of it in those terms, and all the disciples went to their death, proclaiming the message of the gospel. They were all martyred. And so they were very serious about their faith. And I think if we got that serious about our faith today, God would really step in and turn things around.
Now, as we read the book of John, we see that he considers himself the disciple that Jesus loved.
Yes.
It's interesting how he almost speaks in the third person in that respect. And so what do you think about that?
I don't know.
How does
what
it make
do
you feel about John?
It's a weird thing to me, honestly. It's one of the things that, again, it's one of the reasons I think it's authentic because, the guy had a little bit of an ego. I'm the disciple Jesus really loved. And so I don't know. It's an interesting thing. Obviously.
It speaks a lot to the author. I mean, it really speaks to him as a person.
It does.
He's telling this, he's speaking this, but he's also acknowledging, this is the man I was very, very close to. And I know Jesus loved all the disciples, but he felt genuinely loved by Jesus. And so could you say in this day and time, we've not had the privilege of walking hand in hand with Jesus physically with God in the flesh here on the earth. We have his word, which is amazing. They didn't have the New Testament then, as you said, they were living it.
Yeah.
So Do you feel loved by Jesus? How can people feel loved by Jesus? By getting into his word and by prayer.
Yes.
Prayer is simply communication, right?
Yeah. Oh, absolutely.
You know, and that's what you're communication king over here. And I love that, you know, but we have to think about that.
Yes. You know, the most powerful type of communication are stories. It's interesting to me that Jesus had 3 years of adult ministry on the earth. He should have probably, you know, he probably messed up. He should have written a church leadership book or maybe a doctrinal book or a theology book. No. He risked 3 years of adult ministry on telling stories. And very often he never even explained them. Sometimes behind the scenes, he would explain them to the disciples because they were a little bit slow. But the power of stories are amazing. That's why I read the Gospels, because I want to read those stories. And I feel a stronger connection to Jesus when I read the stories of his life. Well, I've got a PhD in theology. And I've read about Jesus, but it's different reading about Jesus, about theology, about doctrine, and reading the stories of Jesus' life. It's a whole different experience.
It is.
So I think, I would encourage people that are watching to go back to the gospel, start all over, go back and read them straight through, focus on John because it's such a powerful testimony.
It is.
But to me, the secret to feel loved, to feel connected is those stories, because stories are so incredibly powerful.
Well, and everybody can relate.
Yes.
You really can when you take a book, a complete book at a time. And I think so many times, at least in my early Christian life, I would go into church on Sunday mornings. I would hear a passage, a few verses, and I'd hear a message, and it was great. It was powerful. But I wasn't reading my Bible because I was intimidated by it. And that's one thing in our ministry at Courage for Life that we care about is making the Bible accessible, even more accessible and less intimidating for people. We really want people to be drawn into God's word. But when you read, especially if you're in a New Living Translation or a more modern translation that is really a great theological translation, it's a little easier to understand and it's not intimidating. What would you say to someone who says, well, I'm not sure, where should I start? You know, I'm new to this. Where should I start? And how do I keep myself from feeling intimidated by this?
Well, first of all, that's why my wife, Kathleen, and I love what you do, because making the Bible easy to understand, relevant to people, I find few things more important than that. And you do a brilliant job of that. And that's why we love what you do. I was at a big church recently, super popular church, great pastor. But I looked around the room and I could not find a single person with their Bible. Not even a phone. I thought, well, maybe somebody's reading it on their phone.
A lot of times
I couldn't even find people holding their phone.
Wow.
And it bothered me so much, I wrote a blog post about it. People just don't take their Bible to church anymore. They don't take their Bible. I
love the physical Bible.
Oh,
and I
yeah,
love marking it up.
absolutely. And I've got your study Bible, for instance, at home where I can really mark it up. However, I spent months finding a thin Bible I could put in my briefcase when I travel. I travel an insane amount.
Yes, you do.
And so I've got 4 or 5 Bibles that I read on a regular basis. But the fact is, you're exactly right. We've got to get back in there because we've just got to respect the Bible again. And I think this is the Word of God. This is. You know, here's my thing. Okay, I don't want to start preaching here, but God gave us a book that tells us where we came from, where we're going, what our purpose is, what our eternal destiny is, and we think so little of it. We read it once a month, rarely or never.
Yeah.
I mean, can you imagine going to a brain surgeon who doesn't have the time to read the medical literature? Would you get on an airline where the mechanics don't take the time to read the mechanical manuals?
Yeah, and stay
and
updated on it. Yeah.
Exactly.
And every time you get in it, you see something new, or God speaks to you in a different way. It's kind of like going to church, and the message that you receive that morning sometimes may be completely different than even what your wife, Kathleen, would receive, or so forth, and the person down the pew, because we have our unique circumstances and situations that it speaks to. And every time I go in here, it speaks something totally different to me.
Absolutely. In fact, how often have I read something 100 times and suddenly, boom, it lights up.
Clicks.
It's completely different. Yeah. And that's why I value pastors and preachers. And I think you're really brilliant at this, who can teach on a passage. And I think, well, I've read that tons, but she said
It's
it
a
in a way
different
that I've never
perspective.
figured it out. Yeah, it's a whole different perspective. You're right. So you never can read the Bible too much. I've got probably 4,000 books in my library at home, much to my wife's frustration. However,
Especially when you had to move.
the vast majority I'll read once and never read again.
Right.
The Bible, I can read over and over and over. It's like Shakespeare in a way. It's so brilliant, but it's even way beyond Shakespeare. But there's that handful of books that you could keep rereading and you learn new things. And the Bible is the supreme king of that. I mean, the more I read it, the more I understand. And it's just amazing.
Amen. Well, thank you so much
Yeah.
for joining me today with this conversation. We both
fun.
love the book of John.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I appreciate you being here. We'll
Well,
bring
thank
you
you.
back on sometime
That'd be
to
fun,
talk
yeah.
about some of our other favorite
I'm
books
not sure
of the
how
Bible.
insightful I am
Oh,
theologically,
you have
but we'll
been
do.
fantastic. And you know what? It's really all about saying, how do we bring this into our world and our
Yeah.
culture today? How is this relevant? And I
So
think
true.
we've talked about that today. Well, Phil, thank you so much for joining me today. This has been a great conversation. Love the book of John and love you being here with us. Thank you very much. And also, if you're looking for a great study Bible, be sure and check out the Courage for Life Study Bible. You can go to courageforlife.org. And also, please join us again because we're going to have more Courage for Life conversations about additional books of the Bible. God bless you and have a great day.